Hello, and welcome back to the Clark and Miller English podcast. And if this is your first time, welcome. Today, as you may have noticed, we're going to have another red episode. What does that mean? Well, a red episode is a podcast episode where we kind of focus on stuff that might be of particular interest to teachers or people who want to get underneath the language somehow, whatever that means. You know, something more in-depth about English. And in today's case, it's very focused on teaching methodologies, different approaches to teaching, and, you know, really thinking about how we teach and what we can do to become better teachers. And today, we are going to talk, well, I'm going to talk and you're going to listen to Ariel Goodbody. Ariel has a great podcast called Easy Stories in English. But there's so much that we talked about today that I just can't begin to summarize it. I think we should just listen and, well, you know what? I can try and summarize it. Here we go. We talked about how Ariel started Easy Stories in English. We talked about a teaching methodology that Ariel is very, very fond of called TPRS, Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. We also talked about how we can use gestures in the classroom, how to teach phrases and not grammar, how TPRS has a lot in common with popular, more well-known teaching methods like Dogme and lexical approaches, things like that. How the word for school used to be the same word as the word for game. And what does that mean? How does that inform our teaching? That's quite an insight. Why we also talked about why storytelling is beneficial to learning, how to use stories to even help business English students. And I also asked Ariel for 2 tips for English teachers to get out there and really improve and get better and become awesome teachers, which we all want to do and we all strive to do, I'm sure. So, yeah, I mean, this is a big talk about methodology, approaches to learning, but don't run away and think it's too technical or anything. This is a very casual conversation, and I think we can all learn a lot from it. I know I did. There was a lot of things here that I'd never really thought about before. So, yeah, without any further ado, let's just get straight into it. And here we are, my conversation with Ariel Goodbody. Let's get started. First of all, do you want to tell us who you are and what your story is? And, give us a brief introduction. Who's Ariel? Ariel?
Well, I am Ariel. I'm 27 years old. I'm a language teacher and writer. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what order to put those in, to be honest. I'm kind of half and half at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I studied linguistics at university. Mm-hmm. And I actually didn't do the module on language acquisition, how we learn languages, but languages has always been something that's really fascinated me, and I've learned a lot of them. And then after I graduated, I tried to make a living as a self-published romance author for a while. I'm not going to tell you my pseudonym because those books have quite, let's say, raunchy demographics and covers. So I don't want to. I want to keep my brand identity separate. So I had a go at that. It went okay. I made about $2,000 over a few years publishing a few books. So bad. I can't say it was a complete failure. Yeah. But I realized that I needed some kind of more stable work to support me while I worked on writing projects. Mm-hmm. So I decided to try teaching, and I did a CELTA, mm-hmm. which is, I'm sure you know, but if anyone listening doesn't know, it's like a certificate in English language teaching for adults. So it's like a TEFL course. And I loved it. I really, as soon as I started teaching, I was like, oh, I love this, because I'd done a lot of like youth theatre and stuff and student theatre, so I feel like in a lot of ways teaching is kind of like a performance. And I definitely enjoyed that sort of side of it and leaning into that. And then as I was studying it, I read up more about, the theory and the scientific evidence, and I kind of formulated my own approach to teaching, and I discovered this teaching method called TPRS, which is all based around using storytelling to teach. And then about a year, maybe about a year into teaching, I'd wanted to do a podcast for a long time. I knew I wanted it to be something related to languages. I wasn't sure if it was going to be something for learners or not. And then this idea just kind of came to me. It was like, well, why don't I combine these two things? I love language teaching. I love storytelling. And what would be a great format for that is, short stories for learners at different levels. And kind of the idea just came to me. And, when you have an idea where you're just like, oh, yeah, no doubt about it, I'm doing that. I started,
and you just sort of react by going, "Oh, of course, of course, that's what I should do."
Exactly.
I relate to that completely. Sorry, go on.
Exactly, yeah. Well, so I started Easy Stories in English on New Year's Day, 2019. I launched it in the new year, and I went in with really low expectations because I know there's so many different resources and stuff for English, and obviously there are the famous ones like ESL with Luke and stuff. But then, there are loads of other ones like your website, for example. There's really so much content out there that I maybe thought, well, is it really going to catch on? Will people get it? That was actually one of my big worries. It's like, well, are people going to actually want to learn with stories, or are they going to... Because I know a lot of students, they have kind of an attitude of... I need it for work, so I have to learn in a serious way, which is really the opposite of how I teach. I'm very sort of wacky.
I relate to that.
But yeah. Well, it brings a lot of you got to bring some fun to the classroom.
Absolutely, and engagement as well.
Yeah. So I started it, and it was pretty successful at first. I was like, okay, people are listening, and then I would say around July, August time last year, it really started to kick off. And I had thoughts before, I was like, well, maybe at some point I'll launch a Patreon. But I went all in with that in September, I believe. And since then, it's just been growing and growing. So I do a story every week. I now have a weekly live stream. I have a weekly newsletter. I do YouTube videos. And I just started like a group chat on Telegram, which has got almost 200 people. So people just love talking with the other listeners, interacting. It's been and loads of people have sent in stories as well. It's just been a fantastic experience.
Oh, really? Oh, fantastic. So learners have also sent in their own stories.
Yeah. So a lot of them send in like, oh, this is like a legend or a story from my country. So cool. That's been really great. And then recently, actually, I had 2 people sending quite personal stories. So one of them was a listener from India who's a nurse and wants to come and work in the UK. So she's been learning English for her to get her IELTS so she can migrate here. So she had a very moving story about, how much work she put in, and she failed her exams, but she's still really motivated to keep going. And then the other story I had was from a student who's blind but listens to the podcast and finds it really helpful, and he is really motivated to study abroad. And it's just the kind of thing where you read it and you're like, oh my god, like I have no right on, people clearly identify this, and like, who am I? I'm just someone making a podcast in my bedroom.
But you're reaching out to people relate to you, obviously you resonate with people, and that's great. Like and you can build a community on that, and that's fantastic. Just for the uninitiated, where can we all find you? Where should we go to?
Of course.
To find
you can tell I haven't done many interviews yet. So it's easystoriesinenglish.com. Cool. For the website, you can find the podcast there.
All one word? Easy Stories in English?
All one word, yeah. That has links to everything. But the way most people find me, I think now, is through Spotify. Actually, I'm curious I think if you go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you search, or even maybe Google, and you just search stories in English or easy stories English or something like that, it should come up near the top.
Cool, that's pretty good. Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's good progress. Yeah, cool. So easy stories in English or any .com or iTunes and Spotify, easy stories in English.
All good podcast providers. Yeah.
Anywhere, wherever you get your podcasts.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, great. Good stuff. You said you started looking into TPRS, which is you said it was a sort of storytelling approach to teaching. Is that right? Oh, before we get going, just so you know, I don't know if you noticed that with our podcast, we have sort of blue ones and red ones. And the blue ones are basically lessons, they're very much directed towards students and learners. The red ones are for everyone, but the focus is more on either teaching. So we're probably going to have a lot of teachers listening to this one. We're doing a red one. And
we're doing a red one.
We're doing a red one, which sounds euphemistic, but it's not, honest. And we can... I thought that would free us up to be able to get into the sort of the nitty-gritty of like language acquisition and theory and stuff like that, because I think a lot of teachers and even some learners could be interested in that.
Absolutely.
So, with that in mind, tell me about TPRS.
So TPRS, I feel like sometimes I'm a spokesperson for TPRS because I have other teachers who message me on italki, this teaching platform, and they're like, oh, can you talk to me? And I will just do it for free because I just love talking about it. So it stands for Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. You probably have heard, or you may have heard if you're a teacher, of TPR, Total Physical Response. Yeah. The reason they're so similar is because of like a copyright issue. So if you don't know, Total Physical Response is kind of an older methodology that's based on using physical interaction with the body. So for example, you'll get students to listen to commands in the target language. Like you might tell them, okay, pick up your book, throw it around, dance on the table, and they have to do all these things. And the idea is it builds this kind of physical link between the language and the body. And TPRS, a lot of the ideas come from that. I think is certainly in the kind of the use of physicality, but it really broadens it much more and adds a lot more depth. So it was invented by a teacher called Blaine Ray, who basically when he started teaching, he had an experience that many, many language teachers have, where he tried to do the traditional route, let's teach grammar, let's teach vocabulary, let's do songs about the past perfect tense and stuff and all of that stuff, and complete disaster. And he said, I think he quit or got fired from several jobs. And at a certain point he was like, okay, this is not working. Let me figure out something that works. And I'm not sure if he did lots of research into the language acquisition theory first, but the theory that really is the core component behind TPRS is Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input.
Okay. I+1.
Yeah. So basically the idea that in order to learn a language, you need input, which is reading and listening, and it needs to be comprehensible, meaning you need to understand it, right? So if I start speaking to you in fluent Japanese, do you speak Japanese?
I don't speak any Japanese, no.
So if I did start speaking to you in fluent Japanese, you wouldn't learn anything. But if I hold up an apple and take a bite and I say, I am eating an apple in Japanese, that's already making big steps towards comprehensibility.
Okay.
So, sorry?
Yeah. So this guy, can I ask really quickly when this was all being developed? When this guy sort of Blaine Ray?
Blaine Ray, BLAINE Ray.
Okay.
I think it's not too long ago. I think it was about 20 years ago.
Okay.
Or 15 years ago. It was really not that long ago. And there had been other methods before based on Stephen Krashen's theories. Like there was the communicative approach, which he actually developed with some other teachers. But TPRS kind of shook the whole thing up. And basically the idea is canonical TPRS, which is kind of how it was first theorized, I believe it just contains 3 core steps. So the first step is you pre-teach some vocabulary, and it's really a small amount. The idea is not to overload students with vocabulary. Mm-hmm. The idea is to teach a small amount of vocabulary and teach it really well. Okay, mm-hmm. And then you build up from there. So you maybe start with 4 or 5 items, okay? Mm-hmm. And they might not just be words, it might be like a little phrase, like, for example, let's say you're teaching French, the phrase might be a souri, which means smiled, right? But in French, it's 2 words, so you teach that as just kind of one thing.
Okay.
And you maybe use gestures to teach those. You probably use translation. That's kind of one of the easiest ways is you write the words on the board, you write the translation. Okay, so they're aware of what those words mean. And then after that comes PQA, which means personalized questions and answers, where just using those new words and, maybe some question words, you try and basically build a relationship with the students. So let's say the words are smiled. You say, or let's say smiling, you say, am I smiling? And then the students have to say yes or no. And then you ask the students, is that other student smiling? Is this person smiling? Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a picture of a poster on the wall. Is this person smiling? Okay. Mm. And it gets a bit silly. Obviously, if the questions, if the words are things like, is someone happy, then it can get a bit deep. Even just asking simple questions, is this person, is that person? It maybe sounds a bit simplistic, but actually for a complete beginner in a language, just being able to communicate with such a simple idea is quite a powerful thing.
And I think actually I think you've hit a good point there as well, because when we go about our sort of everyday lives, we tend to do the same things again and again. So the sort of things we teach like elementary students, we would also be teaching like intermediate and upper intermediate students. Like we all need to know how to talk about our jobs, for example. An elementary student might do it one way and an advanced student might do it another way, but we tend to need the same skills. We just need more like advanced levels of it. So I like the sound of this because, is he happy? With an elementary class might just be yes, no, I don't know. Maybe it depends. But then, with an advanced class, you can get probably some very interesting discussion rolling from that.
Exactly. Yeah. And then after the PQA, you go into the main part, which is the story. And there are kind of 2 ways of doing it. There's the very brave approach, which is you literally improvise a story. So the way I do this with students, so they say, okay, and a lot of it comes into the theatricality. But if you go slowly and speak clearly and make sure the students are comprehending, and you buy into it yourself, it's surprising how actually anyone can really do this. Mm-hmm. Where you'd say, okay, class. Okay, so maybe let's say the word is sad. You say, class, I'm really sorry, but this man, and then you draw a man on the board, like a stick figure or something. So this man is really sad. Maybe you draw some tears and you say, oh, class, he's so sad. Look, he's crying. Oh, he's the saddest man in the world. But why? Why is he sad? And then you get some ideas from the students. Why is he sad? They come up with some kind of problem. And then based on that, you can improvise a whole story. And the key thing is circling. So circling is like the other core component, which is, it's a way of checking comprehension and recycling language. So you start, it's kind of like a stacked tier of questions. So you start with like a 2-answer question, a yes/no question, right? Is this man sad? And you ask maybe a student who maybe looks like they don't understand. They say yes or no. You see they understand. Okay. And then maybe you understand, okay, this man is sad. This man, so the man is sad. He's at home. Ooh, Bill, is he at home or is he at work? Okay, so then you're giving like 2 options. You say, okay, he's at home. Okay, and Maria, where is he? Where is this man who's so sad? Oh, he's at work. Okay, so then you're using the question word. So you're kind of building up from a yes/no question to a question with 2 options to a question word. And it sounds really repetitive, but there are ways of making it really fun.
Course, yeah.
Like you say, like, is this man sad or is Krusty the Clown sad? You know, you just bring in like famous people, or like you say like, okay, let's pick a more interesting sentence. Like, okay, the sad man is eating spaghetti. Is he eating spaghetti or is he eating, I don't know, shark brain? Like, just something completely crazy. And once students get into it and they buy into it, like, they're shouting out ideas. They're not worrying about what they're saying. They're just having fun. And then after that, based on the story, you can do acting it out. You can get the students to draw comics. You can get them to do retellings. There are loads of options, but that's kind of like the core principles.
This is great because, partly from a selfish point of view, I've never heard of this before, and I'm a methodology geek, so this is fantastic. A new one. Can I recap really quickly on what you just said, just to make sure? I probably missed a couple of things. So you start. Actually, you know what? I didn't write down the first step, because you got the PQA. PQA is the second step, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's the first step is new vocabulary. And
vocabulary input sort of thing.
Yeah. And this is why I said at the beginning, this is the canonical way, because I always did it a bit differently. I would introduce the vocabulary as we went in the story. But essentially it's introducing new language, personalized questions and answers, and then the story are the three main steps. Okay,
got it. And how would you like input the vocabulary? Do you just sort of give it to them, or?
I mean, obviously you can't do it with a complete beginner class, but the way, we often underestimate as teachers, if we're in a physical classroom, we have some amazing tools. One, we have gestures. Okay, so if I teach the word eat, I don't need to give a translation. I just mime, right? I'm eating a sandwich or something, or drink. Okay. And you can come up with creative ones. Like if I say die or kill, I draw my thumb and go, so there's gestures, there's pictures. Okay. So to avoid translating, you just draw a little picture like, oh, he ate a burger, and then you draw a burger. And the other one is explaining. So if you have a slightly high level student, and this is what I do all the time on the podcast is, I say, this word means blah, 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 blah. And there's an art to that, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is where the skills as a teacher would come in. And it looks like it might be the most demanding stage as well, I suppose. But cool. Okay, so you've got the vocab input, and you mentioned the French word. My French sucks, so I couldn't remember it.
Assouri.
What does it mean again?
Smiled.
Smiled. Was that one word?
2 words.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it's like has smiled, literally.
Right. So, because I started thinking, and I did a bunch of research before this interview, into SLA benefits of using stories and stuff like that. And one thing that keeps coming up again and again, which I really like, is there seems to be a sort of prevalence for chunking. You know what I mean? When you don't isolate things into one words, but you sort of you try to get them into bits of common language as much as possible, like phrases,
exactly,
and so on. So is that part of TPRS, or?
Yeah, one of the kind of key concepts with introducing languages. Don't teach grammar, teach phrases.
Cool.
Right? So you don't say, I'm going to teach them the past tense this term, because in a story, stories are about everything, right? And you don't want to limit yourself. You're like, oh, well, I haven't introduced that grammar yet, so I can't have that happen in a story. No, introduce it in the story, and the students will understand it from context, because there's really nothing in the brain that says this is advanced grammar, this is simple grammar. There are obviously more complicated constructions, but that's not a reason to necessarily hold something back deliberately. And especially with English, like it's so much of just a grammar is it's word order and it's phrases and combinations of words.
So yeah, that's great, because I see a lot in common here with like lexical learning and lexical teaching, and this whole lexical methodology stuff. It's very compatible with that by the sounds of it. Cool. Then the personalized questions and answers, that's pretty straightforward. And then obviously the story is the sort of centerpiece, isn't it, of the whole thing. And with that, I'm just trying to picture how a lesson would look. So you have this vocab input and the personalized questions and answers. And then, like, how much time... Is this sort of like the beginning and then the story is the main part?
So here's the fantastic thing with TPRS. Once you get experience with it, you don't really have to plan classes. And that might sound insane, but if I'm feeling confident, I can say I'm going to go in, and there's a teacher I really admire called Justin Slocum Bailey, who actually is a Latin teacher who uses TPRS. And I was at a conference last year where he was teaching Latin, and I mean, it was literally the most fun I've had in my life. And I never thought I'd say that about a Latin class. But what he says is, he just comes into class with a question, right? That he wants the students to answer. So the question might be, how long does everyone sleep? Generally, do you sleep 10 hours? Do you sleep 5 hours? Okay, how much? And then based on that, you can ask the students, how much did you sleep last night? Are you sleeping well? Are you sleeping badly? What are the effects of this? Blah, blah, blah. You can make a story about someone who oversleeps or doesn't sleep. You know, there are just so many possibilities. And one of the key things is running with good ideas.
Yeah.
Right? So... It's really easy. I mean, you can script your stories beforehand and you can have it so that, you know, there's a set path, but then you accept some new ideas from the students, or you can leave it completely where you're just like, the students are going to provide all the ideas and you're just kind of taking the best ones and building a story off that. And when you run with it, I mean, an example is, for example, I was teaching a group of students from, Shanghai, and they were all 20, but they kind of they were in the UK for a few weeks, and a lot of them didn't want to be there. So I just made it very silly, and like we were doing a story and talking about a dog or something, and then someone burped in the class, and I was like, oh, okay, do you know what that word is? And I explained what the word burp was, and they were a bit like laughing about it. And then I was like, oh, so the dog gave a big burp, and then it became all about this burping dog. And then later we acted out the story, and I got the student to come up and burp. but the point is,
oh, fantastic.
There have been times where I've planned a TPRS lesson. I've done it. Okay, so we're going to spend 10 minutes on new vocabulary, 15 minutes on PQA, 45 minutes on a story, and that can work fantastically. But there are times where, you know, you're doing PQA and you have such a good conversation with the students where you just let it run for like an hour, or you're doing such a good story that you're like, well, screw these, you know, oh, sorry, don't know if I'm allowed to say rude words.
Oh, say whatever you like. It's fine. Okay.
You know, forget about these other activities afterwards. We can do those tomorrow, but they're having fun now and they're really into it. So let's just keep doing this. So, yeah.
Cool. I see. Wow. Again, it's starting to remind me of other things that I like. So far, everything you've described me, we got this whole chunking stuff happening. So this is something that lexical learning sort of does as well. So that's like something very respectful there. There's also, I don't know if you know about this, there was a sort of huge educational study, I think it was, oh God, I'm going to show my lack of proper preparation here. I think it was done in the 90s. It was John Hattie, Visible Learning.
Can I ask, and maybe this sounds like a bit of a weird question, but was that specifically a TEFL study or like an ESL study?
No, it was generally an educational one. So it wasn't ESL specific.
Ah, okay, I see. Yeah, got it.
But it was...
Because I often find there's quite like weird difference. Like I feel like the TEFL, ESL researchers often just sort of are living in their own little world doing research on stuff that
sometimes
using terms in different ways, and it's a bit crazy sometimes.
I think sometimes certainly that is the case. But so this is like a huge meta study, and it basically sort of discovered or tried to discover what was most impactful for learning, what created the best impact. And he just went through all these small, tiny, like little micro features of teaching and language learning and context or whatever. And one pattern that emerged that I found quite interesting was methodologies and approaches weren't such a big influence, but a lot of them were, but surprisingly what came out on top was the relationship with the teacher and the sort of energy that the teacher sort of evokes in the students. And I think this is touching on that as well, because you have this sort of, the teacher's role is very engaged and engaging. And I guess it sounds like TPRS is something you just can't do without being engaging.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that was the second one. And the third thing, if I may just make the last one, there's a lot of sort of Dogme principles in here as well.
Absolutely. It's very Dogme 95 or whatever that thing was called. And I think it gets a bad rap, and there are parts, honestly, it's much more well known in America, but there are parts of the country, like there are parts of California where if you mention TPRS, you get kicked out. You get booed out the room.
Oh, really?
They won't accept it. People have very visceral responses because I think fundamentally a lot of people kind of understand that the traditional grammar method doesn't work, because if you look at the statistics, I mean, you look at the amount of students who come out of school and they can actually use the language they were learning, it's very, very low. But I think a lot of people, maybe it sounds cynical, a lot of people, I feel like they're trying to, gatekeep it and keep it this traditional way where it's, all based about the love of the language and the love of grammar. And I think that's fine for, the 1% of people that actually works for. There was actually a study that looked at the amount of students in America who learn a foreign language who actually speak it after they graduate. And I think it was like less than 1%. I think it was 0.01%, which means that in a class of 30 students, there is a good chance that 0 of them will ever use the language after they graduate. Which imagine if that was the case for mathematics. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Or pretty much any other subject. And is that high school or is that university students?
High school.
Wow. Okay, it's still pretty bad. Yeah. It sounds a bit like England as well, because the Brits aren't great either at learning languages. That's really interesting. So. Emerging language and Dogme. I like the idea of that. So you have this very flexible class, and then the story part. So you let the students sort of create it themselves. Is that? Yeah. With these. So
you're kind of the mediator. Yeah. So this is the best thing, is when you know the answer, right? Like you've kind of planned a bit ahead and okay, so for example, like I wrote a script for a story where it's like a student wants a pet. So he goes to the zoo and he looks at a bunch of different animals to decide which one is going to be his pet. Okay, that's all that I planned. So I say, okay, class, so Bob really wants a pet, but he doesn't know. Does he want a cat? Does he want a dog? What should he do? Where can he go? And they're like, giving all these things. He goes to the pet shop. I'm like, no, the pet shop isn't good. I know he's going to the zoo, right? But I'm pretending. I'm holding the suspense so that when one of them suggests it, I'm like, oh, that's an amazing idea. They think it's their idea, right? It's a very sneaky tactic, but it works really well.
Well, I guess it can go either way as well, because they may think it's their idea, but also maybe it's like you're gamifying it a little.
Exactly.
And they kind of actually have to guess what the right answer is. So that could be fun too. I guess either way, whether they figured it out or not, there are benefits there. But Hobson's choice.
Yeah. There's one of these, again, mentioning Justin Slocum Bailey, he's amazing. He has a really amazing blog. I believe it's called Indwelling Language. Let me just search it quickly.
Indwelling Language. It's an awesome name. Language.
He's an amazing person. When you meet someone and you think like, oh, this person is amazing, and then they have like a really touching personal life story as well. You're like, oh, you're just perfect. It's indwellinglanguage.com.
Indwellinglanguage.com. Yes, I will probably, it just occurred to me, but I'll probably just put any links and any things we mention on the show notes for the podcast. This will be the first time I've done that. It's kind of obvious. I should have been doing that from the beginning.
No, there are so many things like that when you're like, oh yeah, I should do that.
Yeah.
But he talks about making lemonade. And what he means by that is very often when you're teaching, you have all your stuff planned out and then something unexpected happens and you can try and pretend like it isn't happening or you can roll with it, right? Mm-hmm. So you're teaching and then suddenly the door opens and it's like, there's a new student joining or the fire bell rings or, there's a really loud bird outside. And what making lemonade is like, for example, with Justin, it was amazing because we were in this conference in the south of France and it was in this little, French town. And so we were in the classroom and then at some point the bell tower rang. And when it rang, he went, oh, and he pressed himself against the wall and he said in Latin, it's the hour of death. So dramatically, and then you're like, oh my god. And so as a student you don't get distracted by this noise, you get gripped by it. So like it can be literally anything in the class, but it's amazing how much fun you can have just by playing with things.
Yeah. And it's this all sounds like it's very related to play, which is something we kind of have sort of generally in the teaching world have sort of neglected and forgotten about over the years, over the last couple of 100 years. And that's nice. Yeah, you're bringing this sort of spontaneity, this sort of drama. Cool.
The thing about language and play, I just want to tell you, this is another thing that Justin said, so I don't want people to think this is my original idea. But the original word for school in Latin was ludus, which means game, and they later took the word from Greek, which is schola, but originally the word for game and school were the same, which I think is really interesting.
That, I think, I might work that into the title of this podcast episode. Yeah, ludus, was it?
Yes. Oh, I hope I didn't get that wrong. Justin, don't judge me.
I'll check it, don't worry. And it reminds me, we also have the game Ludo, which now I know why it's called that. But okay, I love that. Yeah, the original word for school was the same word as game, and I think we should all learn something from that. That's a good takeaway. This is great. I was going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about sort of SLA and the sort of research and the benefits and the issues with like storytelling and language, but you've just opened this up into something much cooler. We can before we like wrap up. We could like. There are a couple of questions I still quite like to ask, actually.
Of course.
So, going into a little bit into the nitty gritty. There's basically one question in this area that I want to ask you. Is why is storytelling so beneficial to learning?
So, Stephen, I'm a big fan of Stephen Krashen, and for many reasons, I mean, one of the great things he does is he publishes a lot of his research, a lot of his books for free on his website, sdkrashen.com, which is, for an academic, is just fantastic.
Yeah.
I really recommend his website. Also, Benny Combe-Mason has done a lot of research into reading and using storytelling in class. She actually invented a method called story listening, which is similar to TPRS, but it's more like you telling a story to the class and drawing pictures to explain it and kind of fairy tales and stuff like that. And she had huge success with that in Japan, in the universities. So recently, the research in this area has converged on an idea of input needs to be comprehensible, but also compelling. And what does that mean? It needs to be relevant to the student, it needs to be varied, and it needs to be interesting. And, you can get compelling input in a variety of ways. But I'm sure, as you know, when you go to a textbook for a normal language learning textbook, the texts you find inside are usually pretty dull. Okay, we're going to talk about 10 holiday destinations or an interview with an actor that's 20 years out of date. And, for some people that may really interest them, but you can't know what someone's interests are. What we do know is that stories are completely universal. They are understood. You don't have to explain the idea of a story to someone, right? Every culture has myths and these common stories, these common ideas that appear a lot. You start telling someone a story and they're just immediately hooked, even if it's a really simple one. And they contain a much broader variety of language, especially that's why reading is so valuable, because the language is very rich. You can read faster than you can listen. And I don't know, there's a lot of research into reading. Like, there was a talk I was watching the other day from Stephen Krashen about how reading links to when you look at people who grow up in poverty, the number one factor that determines how likely they are to go to prison, how likely they are to go to university, how likely they are to be financially... It's reading. It's the one thing. It's how much access do they have to books at a young age. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, this is touching on some of the stuff I kind of unearthed while I was researching this episode. The benefits to reading fiction over non-fiction are quite powerful. It can reduce loneliness. It can increase your sense of empathy. It can increase your social skills. It can reduce your prejudice and your prejudices. And it also has cognitive benefits as well that non-fiction doesn't, which is quite surprising because one thinks that they're learning something with non-fiction. I mean, obviously non-fiction does have its own cognitive benefits, but I knew that reading stories and reading fiction was a good thing, but I never realized it was quite so powerful. And I didn't realize about this Krashen research either, that it can be an indicator even of what will happen to you in your life.
Also, on a really fun note, there's even some studies where they look at, let's say you're learning English because you want to. You're studying as a scientist. How much scientific vocabulary can you learn from reading science fiction novels? It turns out if you read enough science, there was one study that I think found that students who read 10 or 20 science fiction novels, they learned the 400, very specific words they needed, like for space physics and stuff. I know that's a really misinterpretation of the study, but you can find the details.
Okay.
It's mentioned on Krashen's website, and it's just so interesting that fiction actually really, has all of these benefits. And the reason I do my podcast, the reason I teach with them is it's all kind of a bridge. Right? Because a lot of people have a lot of hang-ups about reading, especially in a foreign language. But if you start off with these easy, comforting stories and you invite them in and you hold their hand, then that naturally segues into them reading for pleasure from their own stead. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. And you've also got my brain fired a bit here because... if you got a student, one of my biggest nightmares, I'll admit this now, is when I have a student who just needs business English, and that's fine. Yeah. They do need business English, and I respect that because they need to get this for their job and stuff. But I feel a bit lost with the whole business English stuff because I've never worked for a corporation.
Yes.
But then this is a great
it's
potential
a great counterpoint.
Give them a piece of fiction set in a corporation that talks about
give them legal thrillers. I mean, give them there are so many thrillers set in companies, and also there's quite a lot of research that shows that fiction contains about 85 to 90% of the words on academic word lists. So actually the difference between academic or business language and language in fiction, it's not a huge gap.
So that can all be potentially acquired without having to do academic English coursebook or something like that.
Exactly.
Cool. I got one more question. So we're talking a lot about input and comprehension and all of this stuff, and looking at the TPRS sort of lesson flow that you described. It's all good, but it's all quite... I mean, there's some output and there's some participation, but I'm just wondering, at the end of the story, do you have something that sort of wraps it up where the students can sort of consolidate all the stuff they've learnt themselves, some sort of perhaps a communicative task or a writing task or something like that? Is there a sort of fourth section?
Traditional TPRS is there's a really heavy focus on not forcing students to speak until they're ready. And what I find is in the lower levels, there are a lot of students who they really appreciate. It's like, oh my God, I don't have to speak. You know, it's like this huge pressure is taken off them and they can speak as much as they want. As soon as it gets to, you know, intermediate level, students are interacting a lot because they're giving ideas for the stories. And often it just turns into like a discussion. And then, you know, they're speaking a lot without worrying about it. When it comes to writing, it's hard because you don't want them to feel like they're being examined, because that's really not the purpose of the approach. A lot of teachers use free writing. So you set a timer, usually for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and you just say, okay, in this time, you're going to write continuously, don't stop, write about whatever you want. Tell a story, write about what you ate for breakfast, and then that's a great, a lot of teachers, they use it as a way of accountability because they work in a school and they need some kind of grade book or whatever. So they do it once a week, and then they say, okay, at the beginning of the year, Jenny could write 50 words in Spanish in 5 minutes. At the end of the year, she can write 170 words in Spanish in 5 minutes. And then you have a very tangible benefit.
If you need to sort of prove something, because we live in a system where that happens a lot. Exactly. That's so cool. I had a thought. It's gone. Give me a second. It's going to come.
It's okay.
It was about the speaking after. Oh yeah, this whole thing again. You're not putting any pressure on the students to speak. And yeah, again, there are two things this reminded me of. Obviously, Krashen's effective filter, I mean, it's come across like some sort of resistance, but in some corners, but perfect acceptance in others. But I think everyone can more or less agree that generally you don't want stressed students. So this.
I mean, I see a lot of straight up traumatized students who, if you speak too quickly, they block themselves and they cannot comprehend a single word for like 10 minutes. And that's not healthy.
It's not
and
good.
It just says, well, what's been happening in these schools? Like, how is that, that I don't want to be part of that.
Yeah.
So,
You don't want this to speak, damn you, speak. No culture like that. I think that's important. And it's true that with the sort of dominance of communicative language teaching, which I think there's a lot, it's mostly good. But there is this sort of thing, isn't there, where the students kind of have to speak. They must speak or they die. I like this, that it's rethinking that. And obviously the other thing I was going to say that it reminded me of is that obviously TPR does that as well, doesn't it? You're not encouraged to speak. You speak when you're ready, kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And it makes a great, filler activity. That's the thing, right? Brain breaks are very popular among TPRS teachers. So maybe after you do the PQA, they've been sitting down for a while, you get them to stand up, do a little game, There are so many ways to add in these different stages that just allow lots of different levels of interaction that kind of suit different people's personalities as well.
Yeah. So if you have a chatty class, you can just adapt for that and so on.
Yeah.
This is really cool. Well, thanks so much for letting me know about all of this stuff. I'm gonna.
That's all right.
I'm gonna look into this after.
Go on YouTube. You know what? Just go on YouTube and type TPRS, because TPRS teachers, like me, that we're all weird fanatics. We love talking about it. There are so many people who record their classes and put them on YouTube, and they're like, look at me teaching. So you don't get that. I mean, you don't really get that with grammar teachers, right? They're very rarely look at me teaching. No, but with TPRS, we love showing off. So
I guess it attracts a certain personality of teacher, doesn't it? And that's compatible with a YouTuber and someone who's good at the social media thing. I'm tempted by it too, actually, because I think I'm a bit like that also. Yeah. Well, this is great. We covered easily covered everything I wanted to talk about, and much more. Before we finish, last question. 2 tips for English teachers out there. Maybe even especially teachers who are maybe a sort of less sort of extroverted. 2 tips to take away. 2 takeaways.
Slow down. My God, just if you ever feel like, oh, I'm just talking and the students don't get it, they don't get it, you're probably talking too fast. And I say this as someone, I speak so fast and it took me so long to, and I'm obviously right now, this is way faster than I would ever speak with a beginner class. One of the TPRS teachers, I think it was Blaine Ray, who said, imagine that every word is a gold coin dropping out of your mouth. And it really, if you focus on, okay, above all, I'm just going to focus on being clear and comprehensible. That is going to be the strongest foundation for everything, whatever method you teach with.
Okay, so remember the gold coin analogy. That's the good takeaway. Okay.
And the second tip, I only had one in mind. Let's say you're going to go down the road of TPRS, and I know a lot of teachers who shy away from it because they say, "Oh, I'm not that outgoing. That's not my personality." There are so many different types of TPRS teachers, and there are plenty of TPRS teachers who have more of a quiet personality. And as long as you've got that foundation of you can grade your language to be comprehensible to any level of student, you can provide compelling input that you genuinely enjoy and the students genuinely enjoy, then the rest is just your personality. And for me, I love going in with an unplanned lesson and doing this and that. For some teachers, they love to write a story and work with it with the class and, take a more quiet approach. There really are so many different ways of approaching it. But I will say fundamentally, my personal belief is it has to be based on the theory of comprehensible input, because I truly believe it is, maybe this sounds dogmatic, but I truly believe it is just factual proof that is even if other techniques can work in some circumstances, you never meet someone who's extremely fluent in a language who hasn't had hundreds or thousands of hours of comprehensible input.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. So slow down and remember I+1, comprehensible input. Yeah. Cool. Well, in that case, Ariel, thanks so much. That was really, really enlightening. And
thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And that was it. My conversation with Ariel Goodbody. A couple of links here. Ariel's website and podcast you can listen to at easystoriesinenglish.com. All one word, Easy Stories in English. There's a bunch of other links that I'd like to add. They're on the show notes for this episode. You can download them at clarkandmiller.com and just click on the podcast part of the menu and you'll find the show notes. That's it. That's everything. Thanks so much for listening. I really enjoyed that one, as usual. Another fascinating and interesting conversation with a fascinating and interesting person. And next podcast episode, we'll go for some blue action. We'll have a blue episode and it will be a bit more student friendly. So until then, take care and have a wonderful week, have a wonderful day, have a wonderful evening, and just be wonderful. Until then.